This is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. Hello, everyone, and hello to you, John Burke.
Hi, Heather. How you doing?
I am great. It is so wonderful to have you here. We've already talked about near-death experiences and the research you've done. We've talked about your research on heaven through these near-death experiences. And now we're going to cover God. So hopefully those of you that haven't listened to those other two, go ahead and do that. But you can wait and do it after because this is a standalone segment. John is a researcher and he's been researching these near-death experiences for years. And he's written several books. One of the ones that we're going to talk about today, I actually have the audio copy, but it's Imagine the God of Heaven. So, John, why don't you start out and tell us who is the God of heaven?
Well, what made me want to write Imagine the God of Heaven after writing Imagine Heaven is, so many people that I interviewed, and I've interviewed well over 1,000 near-death experiencers. They would say, of all the wonders of heaven, of all the wonderful reunions, where we know each other and there are hugs and there are kisses and it's real, and of all the beauty of heaven, of all the mysteries and wonders of heaven, nothing, they would say, compared to just being in the presence of God. They would say I didn't want to look at anything else. I didn't care about anything else. God was all I cared about. And so I thought, if that's the case, then we need to understand more about who this God is. And I really believe that what God is doing today with channels like yours and others is he's making it where people from all over the globe are basically able to tell their story. And I think this is global evidence not only of God's existence, but of the incredible love that he has for every single person he created, and how he created every single person to be his own unique child.
You mentioned being in the presence of God. What do near-death experiencers say that is like?
Well, so people experience God in different ways. So most commonly, they will say God is light and God is love. Like I was telling you before in our last segment about Santosh Akarchi. He grew up Hindu, but when his pancreas ruptured, his gallbladder ruptured and went into his pancreas, and he hears code blue. And he's up above his body. And he said, this divine light came to me. And he said, I knew this light had ultimate authority. And I wanted to do whatever it said. And I fell in love with this light because he knew it was for him. And that's commonly what people will say. Well, what's interesting is Dr. Bell Chung is another guy I interviewed. He's a professor in Singapore and Hong Kong. And he had a hang glider crash. He's up 50 feet above this crash site. And then he looks and he realizes, oh my gosh, that's me. That's my body. And again, this brilliant glow, this light, white but golden, but palpable. That's what they will say. And this is not an impersonal force. This is a person. And he realized, he said, this being knows me better even than I know myself. And that's commonly what people will say. In God's presence, they've never felt so accepted. They've never felt so loved. But again, like we talked about, love, our word love doesn't even do it justice. for what they feel in God's presence.
One thing that you said, and I believe it was in chapter 14, you talked about just the joy and the laughter in that God has. And I really like hearing that he has a sense of humor. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to show in Imagine the God of Heaven is that God has been revealing himself all along. He's not just showing up in the day of near-death experiences. But we all do. We put God in a box, right? We're finite, so we imagine him with finite, walls. And when you start to see that on one side, God is far more mysterious and sovereign and, all those big words, omnipotent, omnipresent, transcendent, immanent, all these things, but, far more than we've ever imagined, which makes you want to trust him. But on the other side of the box, he's far more relatable and personable and even a fun person to be with. We don't often think of God that way.
Right.
Someone who enjoys and has joy, can laugh, even thinks your jokes are funny. Except my dad jokes. My daughter says he doesn't think your dad jokes are funny, Dad.
When we hear of atheists and they're rejecting God, I often think, I'm not sure if they're rejecting God or if they're rejecting kind of the flawed image of God that they were taught by humans.
Absolutely. And Heather, that's why I wrote Imagine the God of Heaven. I mean, I'm biased, but I don't see how someone can read this and not just be in love with God and want to seek God and want to trust him. Because you just realize that, well, like, if that's what he's like, and if these people are telling the truth, then this is what I've longed for my whole life. And I really think, I really think that's what, I don't see how people could not believe in him. But I do think a lot of it is from our wounds.
Mm-hmm.
So we've all been wounded and we all have had people hurt us. And sometimes we have people hurt us and, they claim to be following God. And maybe they are, but they're just wounded people themselves, and hurt people, and it's pretty consistent. But we tend to put the face of people on the face of God. And that includes, I've had people that I've talked to as a pastor who, when I talk about God as Father, they're like, I can't go there. I can't even associate the word father with God. That's a horrible, because their father was abusive, right? Or sexually abused them or something, some horrendous thing. And we all have that struggle. But I do think that's where these testimonies from all over the globe that are consistently talking about what God is actually like, and then seeing that, this is actually the same God who's been revealing himself throughout history and is not like I thought. I do think it'll change the way you view God. I hope that's why I wrote the book.
And in the book, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you said God cares for all people and we are deeply loved and extremely important to him. And now this is a quote. And even if he isn't important to us yet, or we don't know his identity, he lovingly waits for us to seek his guidance and love. So what does that mean?
Yeah, the CEO that I interviewed in the new book, in the presence of Jesus, he's getting a life review, and Jesus is showing him these difficult times when he was a kid, because he grew up with extreme asthma. And so he was in the hospital a lot. He was overweight. He was bullied. He didn't have any friends. His little dog was his only friend. And he's seen this life review with Jesus, and he's like, why are you showing me this? Like, kind of like, I don't want to see this again. and then it hit him, and he said, were you with me even then? And he turns and he looks at Jesus, and he said, Jesus had a tear and said, I was always with you, just waiting for you to turn to me. And then he shows him another scene in a life review. And now he's an atheist, and he was a medical executive, and he was working as an orderly before that in the hospital. And he's helping, he's bringing food to this 7-year-old cancer patient. And, he's a young kid, but he's bald. And he said to Randy, he said, I'm dying. I'm going to go to heaven. And Randy said, oh, that's good. And he asked him, he said, do you know Jesus? And Randy said, no, I don't really believe in that. But, I'm sure if you believe that, you'll be there too. You'll be there one day. And he's with Jesus watching this scene, and the kid says to him, I'm going to pray for you, and you'll be there too one day. And it just hit Randy that Jesus was showing him that the prayer of this kid, God had honored, and he was there. He was watching from the side of heaven, the scene played out. And so what he took from that was that, God is always with us. And he wants to help us through life. He wants to do life with us, but we've got to turn to him. Because love is his goal. You can't force love. You have to give them freedom to choose either to love you back or to reject you. And that's even true with free-willed people. God has given us free will, and we have the choice whether we will seek to love God or whether we'll just go our own way.
While I was listening to your book, I had to rewind this part because what you were saying, at least this was my interpretation, and I want to see if this is what you meant, that people of various religions are actually calling upon the same God. They're just mistakenly calling him the wrong name. Did I get that right?
I don't know if I said it that way, but I think
those are my words. But
but I think there's truth to that. So in Imagine the God of Heaven, I've told you about Santosh, but also Bibi, who was in Tehran, and she has a heart attack, and she describes this God that appears to her, and she knows it's God, and she described him the same way Santosh did, but it's not what she was anticipating, because she was a Shiite Muslim, and the Prophet Ali is to come and judge her, and that's what she was expecting. And instead, this mighty God of light, but in a robe and long and tall, comes to her and says, I am he who is. And she said, as soon as he said, I am he who is, boom, she resuscitated in her body, wakes up, but with a peace that she had never imagined. And I point out that, the same God of light appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai and the people of Israel. And when Moses asked, who are you? And he said, I am. I am the self-existent one. It was exactly the words. Well, Bibi said it in Persian because he said it to her in Persian, but same identity. And that's true of Heidi as well. We talked about Heidi, who was this young Jewish girl. And yet when she dies, she's there in the presence of Jesus, and she knew it was Jesus, but she also knew Jesus was God. And then Jesus takes her to this place where, they're going through like space, but comes to this place of infinite light, she said. And we went into the light. And then she said, I found myself embraced by God. And she said, God was different than Jesus, but the same as Jesus, but they were separate. And she said, don't ask me to explain how God can be light and God can be love and God can be a man. I don't know, but that's what I experienced. And so you have people all over the globe. Swadik, he's another guy I interviewed. He was an imam in Rwanda. He grew up during the genocide. His mom was a Hutu, his father was a Tutsi. And during the genocide, it blew their family apart. He ended up becoming a street kid at age 8, doing drugs and selling drugs just to survive. Well, when he dies of a blood cancer, he finds himself in this place that he said terrified him. But into this room comes this man in a robe with a beard and is holding out his hands, and he has holes in his hands. And he said he had seen the movie The Passion of the Christ. He said, as a Muslim, I didn't want to go see it, but I got 3 free movie tickets and I wanted to get my money. So I saw it. And he said, so I knew who this was. And he said to him, I died for mankind. You're among those I died for. Never deny it and tell everyone. So this is Swadik in Rwanda still. And he's done that. And he's had 7 attempts on his life, because it's not okay to convert from Islam to becoming a follower of Jesus. And yet he can't deny it. Like in his near-death experience, this is who he encountered. And so, from all over the globe, they're experiencing this same God. And I'm trying to show how this same God has been revealing himself throughout history and giving us a way to know. Now, the other thing that we've got to realize is that God loves every person, and he looks at the heart. And so he doesn't care where they grew up. He doesn't care what background or religious background. He just wants to know, are they turning to him? Are they seeking him? And I like to point out to Christians, same thing that happened with Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. So Peter was a Jew and a disciple of Jesus, and he had learned from the Pharisees and all that, Jews are above the Gentiles, and we don't associate with them at all. And yet in a dream, God tells him, I want you to go to Cornelius. And he says, because God saw Cornelius's heart. Now, Cornelius was a Roman soldier who grew up in pagan idol worship, but it said he was seeking God and praying and doing good. And so then Peter goes and he says, I now realize that God does not play favorites, that he accepts from every nation people who seek him or fear him or seek him and do what is right. And so I think what these near-death experiences are showing is that, yeah, God has always been the God of all people. All the way back in in Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham and Sarah, I'm going to raise you up into a nation, and you're going to be a blessing to all the nations. And you can trace throughout the scriptures, God has always been the God of all the nations. He hasn't been speaking to just Israel or just a particular people group. He's always been doing what he's been doing for the sake of all people of all nations.
So if that's the case, does God care what we call him, as long as we're calling upon him?
Well, I don't fully know the answer to that, except I do know that God wants us to know him.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, here's the way I'd put it. Like, if I fall in love with someone and they're telling me all of the wonderful things they love about me, and I'm telling them all the wonderful things that I love about them, but then I start to realize, like, half of what you're saying about me is not me at all. Like, maybe you love an image you have of me, but not the real me. Well, in the same way, God is love, and God wants to be loved. And God has been revealing things about himself throughout human history, because what love is knowing and being known. And for us making ourselves known to God, but also wanting to know God and trust God and love God. So I do think he wants us to know who he is. But I think God alone knows the human heart. And it says in the Bible that God, in Chronicles, it says God searches the entire earth to support and strengthen those whose hearts are fully given to him. So he is the one who is with us. He's with us always, even if we don't know him. And the Bible says that. I mean, Paul said, in him we live and move and have our being. So I think God looks at the heart, and that's what's most important, is, do our hearts want him?
And there are a lot of near-death experiencers. Certainly there are a lot that come back and they're more religious, but there are others that come back and they're less religious. But that doesn't mean they're not seeking God, because they come back and they really want to know God.
That could be true. Definitely. Though, there have been studies that have said that, but a lot of studies have shown otherwise, like that a lot of people do come back and they start seeking God, and don't necessarily, back, like we were talking about in an earlier episode, about how in the 80s there was a real divide between the church and near-death experiences. But that's not so much. And in fact, since I've written Imagine Heaven, I've seen a lot of churches and a lot of pastors who really realize, okay, these aren't at odds.
There's so much to think about, and I really appreciate everything that you've shared with us over 3 episodes. It's been so informative. Also, you've written some books, and I know that there are a lot of people that are going to want to read those books. They're also going to want to find out more about you. So can you share your website and then talk a little bit more about your books?
Yeah. ImagineTheGodOfHeaven.com is probably the place to go right now. Excuse me. I wrote Imagine Heaven in 2015, really showing the commonalities of near-death experiencers. There are about 120 people that I studied or interviewed in there, and I'm showing how what the scriptures have said of the expectation of the life to come aligns with what they've been saying. In this new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, I've interviewed 70 people from all across the globe, and I'm showing how the commonalities of what they experience in the presence of God, and heaven, they're having heavenly experiences as well. some hellish, but they experience God. And what I'm trying to show is the heart of God, the story of God, the character and the characteristics of God, really, so that by the end of the book, you trust him more, and you want to know God.
That's a great service that you're doing. John, do you have any parting words to leave with those people that are listening right now?
Well, I think something that we mentioned earlier is that just to know that what near-death experiencers consistently say is that God is the love you've always wanted. You know, that every relationship we have on earth is just really a little microcosm of the bigger relationship that brings all our relationships to life. And I believe as you seek God today and tomorrow and more, you grow closer and closer to him in a way that you realize, yeah, this relationship starts to help all my relationships. And so that's what I would hope for all your listeners.
Well, thank you so much. And I cannot tell you, John, how much I have enjoyed having you here over 3 episodes. You've been so informative, and I definitely learned a few things. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Heather.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. Please add comments and questions you'd like future guests to answer. Also, if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. That'll help keep this podcast going. You can also go to Beyond with Heather Tesch to look for more episodes.